Good evening. It's October 17th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to thank you for joining us with our weekly LaRouche Pack webcast here on LaRouchePack.com. We broadcast on this channel every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Benjamin Deniston from the LaRouche Pack Scientific Research Team and by Mr. Lyndon Larouche. Now, Lynn has requested that we begin tonight's broadcast with a clip from a special interview that was just conducted yesterday with Deborah Freeman, who is LaRouche's national spokeswoman and representative in Washington, D.C., but who is also a trained doctor and epidemiologist. Deborah Freeman has written a statement earlier this week, which is currently circulating in the form of a LaRouche Pack leaflet, which is titled, "Don't Let Obama's Lies About Ebola Kill You." And she recorded this 30-minute interview yesterday, which is now available in full on the LaRouche Pack website. What we're going to do right now is play a short clip from the very beginning of that interview, and then we will proceed with our webcast following that.
My name is Deborah Freeman. I have served for quite a number of years as Lyndon Larouche's national spokeswoman and his representative in Washington, D.C. But long before I took on that role, I'm a trained doctor of public health and epidemiologist. I got my degree at Johns Hopkins, and it's an area where I have kept abreast of local developments. And all the way back, at the very beginning, I served as a member of Executive Intelligence Review's Biological Holocaust Task Force, which we pulled together at the very first threat of global pandemics. And that was a good 40 years ago. I think that the first thing that we have to recognize is that both in the short term and the long term, this is a complete catastrophe that could have been avoided. From the standpoint of the short term, when the first cases of Ebola broke out in urban areas, it was March. Up to that point, there had been 18 outbreaks of this particular strain of Ebola in Africa, but it had always been confined to small villages, usually mining villages. But in this instance, once it started to appear in urban areas, everybody knew that we were in for big trouble. The three countries that were immediately involved, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, went to the World Health Organization, they went to the United Nations, and they asked for help. You have to keep in mind, these are the three poorest countries in the world. They asked for help, no help was forthcoming. Nothing was done early on when it would have been a terrible situation because of the poverty, because of the lack of infrastructure. But we were still at a point where it could have been contained. Today we're in a situation where, by the most conservative estimates, we're looking at the likelihood of 1.5 million cases of Ebola just in these three countries by the end of this year. And that is a conservative estimate. The rate of infection had been doubling every 30 days. Then it was doubling every 3 weeks. Then every 2 weeks. Last Friday, the World Health Organization said, we no longer have any reliable numbers because the healthcare workers are so overwhelmed that they can't bother recording cases anymore. And the number of countries, while it's still limited, there are only 5 countries in Africa where cases have appeared, and only 3 of them were at the level of epidemic. Now the Ivory Coast has been added to the list, and both the Wellcome Trust and the WHO have estimated that probably between 13 and 21 countries are at immediate risk of full-blown epidemic. And you have to keep in mind that this is a disease which has a death rate of between 70 and 80%. And rather than the death rate going down as the rate of infection continues to increase exponentially, the death rate is also increasing. So again, had action been taken in March, well, then maybe we could have contained it. Now we have a situation which is out of control. All kinds of promises have been made, but frankly, they're empty promises. I know that in Sierra Leone, for instance, last week they gave up. They said, we have no hope of getting all of the people who are sick into treatment centers. The first thing they did was they established holding centers outside of the treatment centers where they wanted people to come and register and wait for a bed to open up. But the treatment centers were so overwhelmed that these holding centers were becoming literal death camps with bodies piled up. And in an attempt to stop bodies from piling up in the streets, they are now saying, if a member of your family takes ill, keep them home, and we'll deliver a home care kit, which consists of rubber gloves, Gatorade for rehydration, and Tylenol. And they admit that in all likelihood, what this means is that the members of the household are virtually guaranteed to become infected. But it's better than having, from their standpoint, bodies piled up in the street. I mean, this is like a scene out of Boccaccio's Decameron. It is unimaginable, but that's where we're at. And President Obama has said that we would be deploying troops into the area. Most of them have not arrived yet. And that what they would do is construct treatment centers of 100 beds each. We're supposed to build 17 such centers. We haven't set up one yet. But it's also, and we can get into this a little bit more later, but it's the wrong approach. It's not going to stop the spread of the virus, and it's not going to reduce the death rate. That's the short-term situation. Long-term, I think that the first report that we put out under Mr. LaRouche's direction was in 1972. And at that time, the International Monetary Fund was really on a rip. I mean, that was when they really began the most ratchet conditionalities, especially in Africa. And when we looked at the situation, what we said then is if you take a continent, you impose these kinds of conditionalities, you place this many people under conditions of starvation, you provide them with no infrastructure, no clean water, no sewage facilities. What you are going to do is you are going to create a giant petri dish for, I mean, it's the lushest possible environment for the blooming of old diseases and also new, more virulent forms of old diseases. We outlined it. We said that this was a danger, that it would not be limited to Africa, and no one acted. So here we are, some 50 years later, and we're seeing the consequences of decades of bad policy. Now, you have to ask the question, is this a product of stupidity? Is it a product of ignorance, incompetence, or is it intentional? And that question is really not difficult to answer, because at the same time that those conditionalities were being imposed, you had Henry Kissinger, who at the time served as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He authored what at that time was a classified memorandum, National Security Memorandum 200. Now it's famous. But one of the things that he said there was that the growth of population in the developing sector was a threat to the advanced sector. And therefore, it was in the interest of the United States and other advanced sector countries to do everything it could to limit the growth of population in the developing sector. Maybe that's why Queen Elizabeth knighted Henry Kissinger. It was right in line with what British imperial policy has been since the close of the First World War, where you had people like Bertrand Russell expressing his ghoulish fantasies that it would be wonderful if a Black Death came along in every generation to limit growth. And then, of course, you have Queen Elizabeth's consort, Prince Philip, whose most ardent desire is to be reincarnated as a deadly virus. That may have already occurred, judging from the looks of the guy, but it's not accidental. I mean, this is the lawful outcome of an absolutely horrendous policy. The real factor involved here is that these maniacs thought that somehow this would be limited to the continent of Africa or to people of color. But what we all know is that viruses never have and never will observe national borders. And they're certainly not doing it now.
Right, and this is why the proposal from the
What I'm going to do is ask the institutional question in combination with what you just saw from Deborah Freeman. As I said before, Debbie's entire interview is available right now on the LaRouche PAC website, which you can watch. But I would like to pose this question to Lynn in combination with what Deborah just went through so that Lynn can answer them in conjunction. The institutional question reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, clashes have been reported in Libya's second city, Benghazi, amid an offensive to drive out Islamist militants who have taken over the city, along with the capital, Tripoli, forcing the recently elected government, which is internationally recognized, to flee to the city of Tobruk. News reports in the last 48 hours indicate that the interim government is collaborating with Egypt in a campaign to defeat the Islamists. There are reports that Egyptian warplanes have bombed militant camps near Benghazi, and that the Egyptian actions are to continue in coordination with Libyan armed forces on the ground. Those Libyan troops have been recently trained in Egypt. The joint military actions are expected to continue for the next 3 to 6 months, with an Egyptian Navy vessel off the Mediterranean coast near Tobruk serving as a command center for the effort. The Egyptian actions are reportedly being coordinated with the new Libyan Armed Forces Chief of Staff, who recently visited Cairo. The newly elected Libyan Prime Minister Abdullah al-Tini was in Cairo on October 9th, where he met with President al-Sisi and discussed cooperation between the two neighboring states to combat terrorism. The question is, what is your opinion about a close collaboration between the recognized government of Libya and Egyptian government under General al-Sisi in combating Islamic fundamentalist militias and stabilizing Libya?
Well, my experience with this problem, technically and directly, dates from the year 1999, in which I conducted an operation of action, of a planned action, which was specified to deal with a crisis of a war being then launched against Russia by other nations to the south of that. This became a permanent warfare throughout that region of the Mediterranean, for example, and beyond into that. This goes all the way across the continent of Asia. It's still going on today. And the cause of this war was the British Empire, the British monarchy directly. and not only the British monarchy, but other forces which became collaborators of the British monarchy in this operation. We now see a situation of warfare, deadly warfare, across from that same area down to Egypt. We see also in Asia, we see the spread of the same diseases, the same political diseases, motivations that we've seen earlier, since 1999. So what we have is now, this is run always by the British Empire and its associates, the same British Empire that ran the war against the United States itself, in terms of and today represents the basis for secreting the fact of evidence that the British interests, including the Saudi interests, created the entire war. And therefore the enemy is the British Empire and the Saudi accomplice. These are the key forces which globally are creating a situation which is not only destroying the United States directly, destroying Europe and North America, or Africa generally, directly, which is threatening Asia. These forces are the forces that must be destroyed and must be defeated. Now the problem is that up till now, the current president of the United States, Obama, is a key activist in support of this corruption, this evil. And if we wish to save the United States from the deadly death, scourge of death, which is coming now down upon our citizens as well as other parts of the world, we must clean this mess up now. Obama must be removed from office. The British Empire must be constrained accordingly, similarly. Otherwise, we are headed for a war which may be the extermination of the human species before it's ended. Therefore, any human being who is actually human in true qualifications is now committed to join with me, as I was in '99, in my struggle in dealing with this same issue initially. Stop it now, or you lose everything forever.
Well, later in the interview that we just saw a clip of from the beginning, Deborah Freeman goes on to describe the war against Ebola as a world war per se. She said this is a war situation, and we have to address it as we would biological warfare, as almost a war against death. Now, she says what's necessary is immediate international collaboration taking place between the leading countries in the world, which includes Russia, China, India, and the United States. But that is not going to happen as long as Obama remains the president in the White House. Now, Obama's failures to address the Ebola crisis from the very beginning of the crisis are now being well documented. We know that he has severely failed in terms of sending the critical response teams to West Africa. The soldiers that are deployed on the ground already have yet to build any of the clinics that they were sent there to build. This effort is moving very slowly. But what just was exposed yesterday is that Obama was personally warned about the threat of an Ebola crisis as far back as 2008. When he first became president, a memorandum was written by the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, which warned the Obama administration, the Obama transition team at that time, that without immediate action to correct the mistakes that had been made by the Bush administration, an Ebola virus epidemic would be very, very possible. This came out in a Freedom of Information Act request that was produced by the Washington Times and was published yesterday. This memorandum in 2008 by the CDC identified the funding cuts to the CDC as specifically harming any ability to address and handle an Ebola outbreak. The quote from the CDC memo at that time was, quote, programs for rabies, rotavirus, food safety, special pathogens like Ebola virus, and many others need immediate support if they are to sustain their baseline capabilities. And then the memo described the erosion in funding for U.S. disease preparedness under the George W. Bush administration and stated that if core funding is not provided, we will be left many millions behind where we were 5 years ago when adjusted for inflation, and quote, programs for rabies, rotavirus, food safety, special pathogens like Ebola virus, and many others need immediate support if they are to sustain the baseline capability. Now, Obama ignored this, and nothing was done in response to this when he first became president. He was warned 6 years ago. He did not act then. And when he was warned many months ago by different doctors and doctor organizations that are on the ground in West Africa that something needed to be done immediately to respond to the Ebola virus outbreak then, earlier this year, also nothing was done. Now, what's very significant is a leading doctor who Deborah Freeman has highlighted in her recent statement, a fellow named Michael Osterholm, who's the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, gave an interview yesterday where he said the issue is that we cannot take our eye off of the real ball here, which is West Africa. It's a travesty that we have not responded to that outbreak. He said, we were warned about this way back in July. We had the opportunity then to intervene in an aggressive way. We still have not constructed one hospital bed in West Africa. Everything is moving in bureaucratic time. And what he said is, it's a travesty. I think that the whole world has got to understand. For the World Health Organization, Ebola will be their 9/11. For the world, West Africa is our global Katrina. And then he called for a Manhattan Project mobilization to produce an Ebola vaccine. Now, this same gentleman, Mr. Osterholm, published an op-ed in the New York Times as far back as September 11th of this year, 6 weeks ago, where he warned at that time that if nothing is done to address the Ebola virus in West Africa, he said, quote, this has the potential to alter history as much as any plague has ever done. He warned of the danger of rapid mutation of the virus, causing it to become far more infectious than it even already is. And he ended, this was in September 11th of this year, he said, if we wait, instead of taking major action now, we risk the disease reaching from West Africa to right here in our own backyards, which is precisely now what has occurred. So, Lynn, I would like you to say more about what is the necessity of impeaching Obama immediately and removing this obstacle to the necessary international cooperation to solve this crisis.
Well, the origin of the problem is the British monarchy. That's the first thing. This has always been the case of the leadership of the British monarchy, is to reduce the population of the world to comfortable great conditions, which is specified by the dominant figures behind the British monarchy. This has been the problem. Everyone who supports the British monarchy is actually, whether they know it or not, is condoning genocide against the entire human species. That has always been the case. Bertrand Russell spoke this quite frankly. His associates said this repeatedly. Frankly. The statement has been made again, frankly, by the British Empire. It's been made by what we have. The Saudis have made the same thing. The entire Saudi empire. All the accomplices of the Saudis have committed the same crime and are committing it now. And they will get you personally inside the United States or wherever you run to hide unless you do something about it to stop it now. You cannot tolerate the British Empire's stamp in Europe. You're a murderer if you do. You are conceding to become a mass murderer of your own people unless you do that. The British Empire must be shut down permanently because this is the root of the whole thing. Everything of the evil that has gone down in the history of the Mediterranean region has been British in its origin. They can tell you that in India. They can tell you that in China. They can tell you that in every part of the world. These are the enemies of the human species. And the time has come when they have taken a position and have deployed action, accelerated action, which will cause the genocide wave, which will eliminate each of you personally, unless you do something about it. If you tolerate this, if you condone it, you are guilty. And you have to realize that the rate of acceleration of the death rate inside the United States itself presently is every one of you does not know whether in a couple of days from now they too will be struck down like many of the people who've already been struck down as models, who have died or are on the way to die because this disease created in this way has caused all kinds of people to go to death, the most horrible kind of death. And this can spread through much of the United States and beyond, and to other countries. And only nations that reject the British Empire, those who reject what's in Asia that we have, of the nations which have recently risen to power, to China and others, these nations must be saved. They must be defended at all costs. Because what you're looking at now is not the possibility of some deaths of individuals. What you're dealing with now with a disease, a panic, an epidemic of a type can wipe out the entire human population, very much like the Black Death did in the Middle Ages. You're going through a Middle Ages type Great Death. And every one of you that does not fight this disease, that does not fight Obama, that does not fight the British Empire, is writing the ticket for their own very early delivery of a disease which they thought could never happen to them.
Well, the British Empire has been on record for hundreds of years, calling explicitly for the use of biological warfare, the use of epidemic disease to reduce the world population. I would like to read one quote from the infamous Thomas Malthus, where he says in his essay on population in 1791, "We should facilitate instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality. If we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction, which we compel nature to use. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague." Unquote. And then Bertrand Russell in 1951 said explicitly, "War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect of population reduction, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. Now, Lynn, you have warned of this, the danger of exactly the conjunction of these three forms of satanic evil: the use of war, the use of disease, and the use of famine to reduce the world population, as the British Empire has explicitly avowed their intention. All three of these are now taking hold of the entire transatlantic sector: plague, famine, and war. All the way back in 1974, you delivered a testimony in front of the House Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives. This was during House Judiciary Committee hearings on the nomination of Nelson Rockefeller for Vice President of the United States. But what you said in your testimony at that time is the following. You said, U.S. Labor Party scientists and other specialists in economics, biology, and ecological studies have produced highly qualified reports indicating that as a result of the inevitable internal features of a Rockefeller economic program, should that program be carried out, there would be a massive collapse of the world's cooperative labor process by approximately the middle of the next decade. The concomitant neglect of those portions of the Earth's biosphere that depend on the intervention of human labor for their maintenance, the accompanying deterioration of public health on a large scale, and the general deterioration of life processes will inevitably result in the outbreak of pestilence in unpredictable varieties and numbers. The criminal stupidity and immorality of Rockefeller's fascist economic programs leads directly to general ecological holocaust, unquote. So you've been on the record for over 40 years, warning of precisely the situation that we face today. My question for you is, with this said, no one can honestly say that we didn't see this coming. What's the source of the moral failure of those who did not heed your warnings and refused to act?
Well, the problem is elementarily that people cave in to certain kinds of pressures. And the characteristic of this pressure is what we call opportunism, that they would rather sell their soul at a bargain price than defend it. And that's what the answer is on this thing. The people I have opposed, and my only fight really in this whole course of events, as an adult in particular, is that to recognize that this problem is the source of the evil, which has brought the evil upon the people of the United States themselves. The fact that they will consent to say, well, he's a leader. You've got to listen to him. He's a leader. What is he leading you to? Is he leading you to an early death? Is it leading you to a deprivation of the right to life? Is it turning your children into tramps and prostitutes, which is what's commonplace in the United States today, throughout the United States today? All these things have been allowed by successive presidencies of the United States in particular. And they continue. The current president of the United States, still president, has been one of the most satanic figures on the planet during his tenure of office so far. If you want to allow the defense or praise, for example, of Obama, you are satanic. You are actually the agent of Satan, in effect. if you would give in to these kinds of policies, you are a traitor to your own birth and to your own ancestors and your descendants. The duty of mankind is mankind. The duty of mankind is not some person's rights, is not some person's privilege. The duty of mankind is the duty to all mankind, insofar as mankind is enabled to provide the means of delivering this security. That has been our policy of the United States. It's the principle of the United States Constitution. It's an offense against the Constitution. Anybody who practices that policy of treason against the United States, against the people of the United States, is a traitor. The same thing as a skunk coming from Saudi Arabia. And remember how many people in Saudi Arabia who were the worst skunks have been protected by two presidencies. Protected by two presidencies which were nothing but mass murderers and treasonous skunks. Now we have this disease before us. We have this crisis before us. This threat of poverty, of mass poverty, mass hunger, mass deprivation, and sudden and mass loss of life. It's all here. Why is it here? Because you, even an ordinary citizen of the United States, has given up to say, well, in my own interest, I have to assent to this. In my own interest, I have to take advantage of the opportunity I have to survive. And a culture of mankind that accepts that kind of degenerate view of their own lives produces one thing: the probable extinction of a large part, or even the extinction of the human species as a result.
So Lynn, this will be the last question for tonight. This comes from a collaborator of ours over in Germany who was asking about the immediate nature of the economic and financial crisis. So I want to read his question, but then also pose it in the context of your forecasts and warnings of the interrelation between economic conditions and these pandemics and diseases like we're talking about tonight. So the question reads, in the last days, echoing the warnings of other top bankers, a Bank for International Settlements official has come out warning about a relatively violent market crash. And this last Monday, top U.S. and British bankers played a war game scenario, preparing for a coming crash. So now looking back at Title II of the Dodd-Frank law, enacted in 2010, and its equivalent European siblings, it should be obvious even to the layman that once the liquidation of one major bank, one so-called globally systemically important financial institution, once the liquidation of one of these major banks takes place, it will be impossible to deal with the case separately. And rather, one would very quickly be dealing with the liquidation of the entire banking system, not just one bank. Now, since in the bail-in scheme, derivatives are not to be touched, bank accounts of industrial firms, state governments, and normal citizens will then be taken instead, or converted into soon to be worthless bank stock. So in short, the real economy would come to a screeching halt, with all the implications of that for the common citizen day to day. So the question is, given this situation, would it not be absolutely necessary that Congress immediately return to Washington and promptly enact the Glass-Steagall resolutions, now before both houses, Otherwise, the threats of chaos and martial law that were made to Congress by the Bush administration in 2007 would seem like a picnic in comparison with what we'll be experiencing soon. So that on the financial side, but I wanted to just take a second and ask you about the relation of this financial crisis to this threat of Ebola and the pandemics. As has been referenced, you had warned very clearly in the 70s and 1980s that such a biological holocaust would be the knowable result of these economic policies of the British Empire. I went back and I saw a 1985 document that you wrote entitled The Role of Economic Science in Projecting Pandemics, where you discuss very clearly the relation between when you have a collapse of your potential relative population density. Below certain levels of your existing population, you start to get the conditions in which these things can explode, these pandemics. And in that statement you wrote, it is merely necessary to estimate the rate of fall of the potential relative population density towards such threshold levels, and take into account the duration of such conditions historically indicated as consistent with the brewing of new upsurges of pandemics, to then foresee when, how, and where a continuation of the 1974 trends in monetary and economic policy would probably generate such eruptions. So I want to, with this interplay between disease and economic breakdown, is this not the potential for a perfect storm in which these two crises can play off each other, accelerating one another at a rapid rate? And how should we think about this and handle this as a single process, not as two separate issues?
Well, take the case of the United States itself presently, and take the case of what the recent legislation which you referred to here. All right, Dodd-Frank, if Dodd-Frank is applied to these kinds of circumstances which now exist, then Dodd-Frank, or anything like it, assures mass death of the population of the United States. They'll all be dead. Now, because the action will be that if you take a population which is reduced in its ability to maintain its existence, you drive that down, you create shortages, you create conditions of oppression where you begin to loot more and more of the general population, the paid population. You will create immediately what we are already seeing in the United States already under Obama. And it is Obama himself and his policies which have introduced this condition of threat to the people of the United States, which have introduced the conditions under which many citizens of the United States are already in the process of dying suddenly, very rapidly. It only takes a couple of weeks or less, and they're dead and rotting. If you have a population under these kinds of conditions, you will have a mass death of the population of the United States screaming across the entire American continent. Now, anybody who supports these policies is already a mass murderer of Americans, is a criminal of the worst order. Whether they intended it or not, they chose the course. They chose the destiny, and they cannot protest that they were innocent. Anyone who supports this kind of policy is a mass murderer in principle under these conditions. The stresses are so great, there is no room for a possible recovery. And therefore you can see the virtual mass death of the population of the United States coming down on you all right now, among other nations that are staged the same thing. There is no excuse, there is no justification for supporting those elements of Wall Street and similar types who continue in these practices. What must be done is these guys who have worthless values, which they prize highly, will simply be told, buddy, you lost the cause. You gambled on winning the war, on winning the market, but you lost, buddy. You lost it. You lost it permanently. There will never be a recovery for you. Unfortunately, buddy, what are we going to do with you since no one is going to feed you anymore?
Well, with that said, I would like to bring today's webcast to a conclusion. I would like to thank Lynn very much for joining us today, and also thank you to Benjamin. And as I said, the full interview with Deborah Freeman is available on the LaRouche PAC website. So thank you for joining us tonight, and please stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com.